Dr-cathy-stinear talking to us. She's a clinical neuroscientist whose research focuses on predicting and promoting recovery after stroke. She has her research group up at the City Hospital, which gives her access to patients within days of stroke, which is quite, I guess, useful for the kind of work that she's going to be talking about. Cathy has 100+ publications in neuroscience and neurology journals, including Brain, Stroke, and Lancet Neurology. And her current research focuses on testing a range of neuromodulation techniques for neuroplasticity and enhancing neurorehabilitation, which she's going to talk to us. So while I was digging around, I found that she got her PhD from Auckland in 2004, and her thesis won the Best Doctoral Thesis Award for that year, and it focused on writer's cramp, which many of us suffer from. So that would be something useful, I think. She's been in the Department of Medicine since 2008, and she's currently an associate professor there. Over to you.
Thanks, Leonard, and thanks for the invitation to come down and speak to you guys. I think I was here a couple of years ago, it's probably more. So it's lovely to be back. And today we're going to be talking about proportional recovery from motor impairment, or impairment generally after stroke, and why is it 70%? And I'm hoping that by the time I finish speaking, you'll be as intrigued as I am about why on earth the number is 70%, and perhaps might even have your own ideas about how we can investigate that a bit further. So just before we start, I'd just really like to acknowledge my colleagues and collaborators in this work. Winston Biblo, Suzanne Ackley, Alan Barber and Marie-Claire Smith. They've all contributed enormously to what I'm about to show you. I'm just the lucky one really who gets to come and speak with you about it. And I'd just like to acknowledge our sources of funding and support from the ADHB as well. So to get started, we really just have to define some terms to make sure we're all on the same page. So we're going to be talking about impairment and not so much function. So impairment in the motor system is really about your ability or inability to simply produce voluntary movement. And these are quite simple, basic movements, and such as bending your elbow, extending your wrist, making a fist, abducting your shoulder, and so on. So these are the building blocks for coordinated, functionally oriented movement, but impairment is just about your ability to voluntarily activate those muscles and produce the desired movement around the joint. And in stroke, it's really commonly evaluated with something called the Fulfilment score, or FM. So this is it's been around about 40 years now, actually, and it's a highly reliable and validated clinical assessment of motor impairment. What's important is that it's really hard to cheat on this, okay? So that's what helps to make it a highly reliable test. Contrast that with function, and function is really about your ability to complete a task. So you have a goal in mind, such as make a cup of tea, and how you go about that isn't important. What's important is, can you do it? Can you achieve that goal, and can you do it safely? Right, so what that means is that you could have two people with the same level of impairment who have vastly different levels of function. And we see this clinically all the time, because you can compensate for your impairment, you can adapt for your impairment to achieve your functional goals, okay? But you can't compensate around the impairment. So obviously people with less impairment are likely to have better function. Not always the case, but often. And so we really just need to keep in mind that we're not talking about motor function today. We're talking about motor impairment, which is much more simple than that. All right? It's not about completing goals. So we also need to be clear what we mean when we talk about recovery and outcome. So these are 3 hypothetical patients with their days post-stroke and their upper extremity Fulfilment score, so that's a measure of impairment. The maximum score is 66, which is what most of us would score here today. All right, and these 3 people all started in different places on that scale, but finished in the same place. So they've had different recoveries, because recovery is the absolute difference in their baseline and finishing scores. So they've all improved by different amounts, but they've landed in the same place, which means they have the same outcome. Right, so we just have to be clear that recovery and outcome are not the same thing. Contrast that with these 3 patients who start in 3 different places and finish in 3 different places. They've actually had the same recovery, which is the same absolute improvement in their impairment, but they've all finished in different places, so they've got different outcomes at the time of measurement. All right, so I'm going to be using these terms today, so I just wanted to be really clear that you know what I mean with those words. So we're going to talk about proportional recovery. And this comes from a study that's actually almost 10 years old now, and I think often the way for landmark studies, they are completely off the radar at first. People just don't appreciate how important they are. So this study was first published almost 10 years ago by Prabhakaran and John Krakauer, and it wasn't really noticed by people in the field. Now I partly blame the authors for that because they were publishing in a rehab field and they used a lot of Bayesian mathematics, and you know what, the average clinician does not engage with that. So they had a pretty big communications problem. But people have finally caught on. What they found was that feeble motor scores increased by about 70% of the available improvement for most patients. So that's the bottom score of 0, the best score of 66. If we start with 3 patients, X, Y, and Z, they're at their 3 different starting points. The available improvement is the difference between where they start and the maximum score. That's the most recovery they could exhibit. That's the biggest change in the score they could show us. And what these guys reported was that most people recover about 70% of the available improvement. Okay, said everybody, really not knowing what to do with that bit of information. But since then, several other studies have replicated this finding in the upper limb, and it's now been observed in over 500 patients all around the world, and that's quite something in itself. So what that means is that they've got the same proportional recovery. Yes?
So, Cathy, can you just go back? Can you just say again what available improvement means?
So available improvement is the gap between where you are at baseline and the maximum possible score on that scale. So soon after stroke, you might have a score of 10 out of 66 on this scale, so you're quite badly impaired actually. And so your available improvement is 56 points.
But how do you know what that maximum is?
It's a very good point. It's the theoretical maximum. Quite aside from what is actually possible for that patient, theoretically they couldn't score more than another 56 points because the scale only goes to 66. So it's just a purely mathematical theory or limit on it. Now where people actually land depends on some pretty important things which we're going to talk about. But I think what was remarkable about this first study was that they found that people very consistently recovered about 70% of their available improvement. So that's what sort of eventually got people's attention. So if we plot these people, they look more like this. They start in different places and they finish in different places, and that's the clinical reality. But in fact, they were all experiencing the same proportional recovery, right? So they're all recovering the same proportion of the available improvement. So in fact, these patients are all behaving the same way, even though they start and finish in 2 different places. Okay, that's in contrast to the 2 examples I gave you before. So the observation made by Prabhakaran back in 2008 was that this rule, they called it the proportional recovery rule, did not hold for the more severely impaired patients, the people with the lowest scores at baseline. So they said, gosh, if we look at our data, anyone with an initial score of 11 points out of 66 or below, they don't seem to follow this rule. They make only a small improvement or none. They can even just stay completely still in their scores, and their improvement certainly isn't proportional. So there's 2 groups of patients here, people who follow the rule and people who don't, and the ones who don't tend to have these very low initial scores. And that sounded appealing, you know, clinically. Great, we know that those patients with a score of less than 11 won't recover proportionally. The only problem was that all the studies that came after it found a different cutoff point. Some were as high as 19, some were 15, so actually that's not going to help us, is it? There is no specific number that distinguishes between the people who will recover proportionally and the people who won't. So we decided that we might need to measure the brain to understand this a little bit better. It seems obvious, but so far everything has just been measuring what that hand and arm can do. So we thought we'd measure the brain, and that objective measures of the corticospinal tract in particular might be useful. And a quickie refresher, for those of you who might not have a lot of neuroanatomy at your fingertips, the corticospinal tract is a monosynaptic descending pathway from the primary motor cortex, which has the greatest responsibility for controlling the hand in particular. Okay, so most hand control comes from this monosynaptic corticospinal tract. And we can evaluate its functional integrity with, hello,
Does monosynaptic mean only one synapse when?
Yep. So there's only one synapse, and that's at the alpha motor neuron pool in the spinal cord. So it's very fast conducting.
And that's all myelinated?
Heavily myelinated. These are large myelinated axons, so they're very, very fast transmission.
Sorry.
Which is what we need for this super fine coordinated.
I'm not medical, but I have been about it.
No, that's all good. Just
Yeah.
stop me if you do have questions like that. It's totally fine. So we can evaluate the function of that tract using something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. And this is a safe and painless and non-invasive way of activating neurons on the surface of the brain. And when we do that over the primary motor cortex and activate those neurons, they fire, they send a descending volley that's quite synchronized because we've made them fire all at the same time with the stimulus. And when that descending volley heads south, it activates those alpha motor neuron pools and the peripheral nervous system, and we can record a response in muscles on the opposite side of the body just with surface EMG. So we can pick up in what's called a motor evoked potential. And that's probably the simplest thing you can do with TMS. Just see, if I stimulate here, do I get a response here? And it just tells you, does the connection still work or not? Or has it been really badly broken by the stroke? Another thing we can look at is the structural integrity of these descending white matter pathways, and we can do that with MRI. And in particular, one area of the brain that seems really important is the posterior limbs of the internal capsules, because it's there that the descending white matter pathways sort of really bunch up and form a really tight, highly coherent, directionally coherent pathway passing down through the middle of the brain before decussating to the other side. So these are two key things that we can do to see whether or not that connection from the primary motor cortex out to the body is still working. So just to look a little closer at TMS, it involves holding a coil of wire that's insulated with plastic gently against the scalp. We discharge a big capacitor through that, and that creates a very brief and changing magnetic field. And that field passes painlessly through the scalp and the skull and the meninges, and that very rapidly changing magnetic field induces current flow in the underlying tissues, right? And that current flow can depolarize the neurons near the surface of the brain. Just sends that descending volley down out to the muscle, record it with surface EMG. This is what motor evoked potentials can look like. The red one on the left is from the healthy arm, the blue one on the right is from the stroke affected arm, and most typically it has a delayed latency and a smaller amplitude, which just reflects that it's less able to transmit descending commands because it's been damaged by the stroke. And we and others have shown that this test is particularly useful when people have severe initial weakness. So we observe that patients who are very weak initially, about half of them will still have responses to TMS. We've seen patients who have actually no voluntary muscle activity at the time of testing. So when they attempt to activate any muscles in their arm, nothing happens. But when we use the TMS, we can get a message through. So they're unable to produce a highly synchronized descending volley just because of the damage they've sustained, but we can artificially with the TMS. So those patients in whom we can get a response have a better functional outcome than the people who don't have a response. And I pick my words carefully, that's a better functional outcome. That's not the same as recovery from impairment. Just remembering back to what I said earlier. Okay, so for structural integrity, we use diffusion weighted imaging, and we look particularly at the sensory and motor tracts, the white matter tracts from cortex down to the brain stem. And what we've been doing is calculate, there's several things that you can do. Yes, I did put these on, excellent. You can calculate fractional anisotropy, so that's the directionality of water diffusion, either along the entire tract or within volumes of interest at different levels of the tract, and the main volume of interest is at the level of the posterior limb of the internal capsule, as I said before. Yep, just exactly what I just said. And we're also using it to investigate what we call the lesion load, which is the percentage overlap of the stroke lesion on these key tracts. So all of these things are quite informative for telling us how much damage has the stroke done to these key connections in the brain. So we were the first to show a couple of years ago now that people will follow the 70% rule provided they have responses to TMS. So to proportionally recover motor impairment, you need to have a functional corticospinal tract. So I'll just talk you through what you're looking at. So these are data from the same set of patients at 6 weeks and 12 weeks. This is the available improvement, and this is their actual improvement. And the dotted line is the 70% rule. If you're sitting on that line, it means you've recovered 70% of the available improvement. And you can see that at 6 weeks, actually, most people are still bumbling around underneath that line. But by 12 weeks, they're sitting pretty nicely. That's the regression line there with confidence intervals, so it's sitting bang on top of that 0.7 line. But there are two groups of patients here. The filled circles are people who are MEP positive, so they form this group that sits nicely on the line and follow the rule, whereas the open symbols are people who are MEP negative. And you can see that they don't really rise up to that 70% line over time, right? They stay in this bottom right-hand corner. We further divided them using a diffusion weighted imaging measure. So don't get bogged down in this, just that the triangles are less badly affected by the stroke than the squares. And you can see the triangles tend to float up a little bit better than the squares. I think the most important thing to get out of this, the point of this study, was to show that these people here who start with an available improvement around 60, these are the ones with the most severe initial impairment. For them to have 60 points to gain, it means that soon after the stroke they were only scoring about 6 out of 66. So they are very badly impaired, right? And the previous studies had all tried to find a cutoff. Was it 6 points, 10 points, 15 points, 19 points, not really sure. And what we're showing here is that actually there is no cutoff, because you can get all of these patients with a really severe initial impairment, and only the ones with responses to TMS will follow the rule, and the ones without responses to TMS will not. So in other words, if you have a severely impaired patient, you cannot tell by just looking at them whether or not they will exhibit proportional recovery from impairment. You have to test this connection of the brain to know whether they'll follow the rule or not. Does that make sense? Because that was a pretty important point.
Can I ask a question for this study? How many patients were you unable to recruit that couldn't have TMS, that has contraindications?
2%. 2% of our patients are contraindicated to TMS. Yeah.
And was it
I'm glad I know the answer to that. I had to actually figure that out a few months ago, so I'm glad it's still to hand. Yeah.
And resting or active threshold?
Always resting.
Always resting.
Yep. Always resting. Mainly because the people that, so when we have someone that we're struggling to get an MEP out of, a response out of, we do go to 100% on the stimulator, so we turn it up to its maximal intensity of stimulation. These people are usually very severely impaired, so we can't get a reliable level of background muscle activation from them. So what we do is we facilitate them by asking them to grip with their good hand and to try to do the same thing with their weak hand. They usually can't, but we basically throw everything at it to see whether or not we can get a response. So the MEP negative ones, we're pretty sure they're MEP negative. Yeah, pretty sure. Yeah.
So that's a quick question.
Yep.
And maybe the first question was similar to what I'm about to ask in different terms, but there seems to be one there that has no functional track but made a 70%
Yeah.
recovery.
This little guy?
I guess I'm looking on the right-hand side to try
And this one? Yeah, so there is always a couple
So
who totally mess up your data set.
Yeah.
They're
If they've got no
humans.
functional track, how can they actually recover?
So there are some limitations to TMS, right? And one of the things that we know is that it depends a lot on the geometry of the cortex underneath the coil. So we know that the field is most effective where the axons are bending, right? And so depending on exactly where the upper limb representation is and how it's arranged over the cortex, sometimes that's an issue. The other issue is too that people have different skull thicknesses, and that varies massively with ethnicity. And so we know that for some people of certain ethnicities, we know that we're at a slightly higher risk of having a false negative, because we just can't get sufficient stimulation, because the distances are too great, because the field decays exponentially with distance from the surface of the coil. So there's always a couple that mess you up. But on the whole, we think that it's important to have a functional tract to be able to exhibit proportional recovery. And we've shown that again. I'll show you the next study.
So does the skull actually attenuate the field?
No, it's all about distance. It's just distance.
So it's sort of like equivalent to air, doesn't
No, it doesn't.
produce it.
No, it doesn't. But it's all about the
Oh, I see,
distance. Yeah. Yeah. So again, it comes down
So
to
it's
geometry,
costing, for example.
distance of the cortical surface from the scalp, and that can actually vary quite a bit, surprisingly. Yeah, from person to person.
So, Kathy,
Yes.
what sort of rehab treatment are these patients undergoing?
Such a good question. You're so preempting my next slide.
I'll
You ready to move on? Okay. Just some numbers. I figured you guys might like to see numbers. My clinical colleagues sort of break out in hives. Oh, don't put that on them. Never mind. What about the thing? Okay, so just to demonstrate that at 12 weeks, for MET positive participants, the only predictor was their initial impairment, which is their available improvement. Right, so we put in loads of other things. Age, what type of stroke did they have? How much therapy did they get when in? Their gender, right? Their initial stroke severity measured with a global neurological scale. We put in loads of other possible predictors, and this was the only one that mattered. And you can see that at 12 weeks, they're not quite at 70%, but by 6 months, they're pretty much bang on. For the MET negative patients, so the people that we couldn't get a response to TMS from, you can see that the thing that matters is this diffusion weighted imaging measure, the asymmetry of their fractional anisotropy at the posterior limbs of the internal capsules. So that's what matters. Age sort of came and went, but really it's fractional anisotropy, as you can see there. Okay, so we also measured excitability of the primary motor cortices, so we didn't just look for do they have responses or not, we also established the rest motor threshold on both sides of the brain. And we did a similar calculation using the good side of the brain as normal. We found out how far off that were they, so the threshold was higher after stroke. So what's the difference between the two sides? And then to what extent did they recover back towards their normal? And we found that the relationship is nowhere near as tidy, but it's still 70%. So there's still this proportional recovery of motor cortex excitability measured with TMS. So the recovery of function in that ipsilegional M1 seems to be quite importantly linked to proportional recovery from motor impairment. Importantly, recovery from impairment is not related to therapy dose, which was your question. So this is upper limb therapy dose in minutes, that's total. That's slightly alarming. And this is their change in FM score, and you can see that there is no relationship there. So what that means is that current therapy practices do not meaningfully interact with recovery from upper limb impairment.
Does that sort of mean that physiotherapists are wasting their time?
We'll come to that.
I'd love to answer that question.
Don't worry, I've got you covered. Don't you worry. And a few more numbers for you. This was for the change in excitability, so that's the change in the rest motor threshold. Again, it was only their initial rest motor threshold impairment that mattered. That was the only predictor. And it sat right around that 70% mark, a beta of 0.7 again. Yeah. And yeah, again, for the people with a variable therapy dose, because one set of people had a standardised therapy dose, the variable therapy dose was used for this analysis. Again, it's about 0.7, but it's initial impairment that matters, not therapy dose. Okay, so what does it all mean? Well, we weren't really sure because that was a smallish number of people, so we did it all again with 207 patients just to see are we really on the right track here. Bigger sample, and what was important about this sample was that unlike the previous one, we included people with both ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke, we included people with previous stroke, we included people who had had acute medical treatment like clot busting therapy and clot retrieval. So we tried to include a more heterogeneous sample that was more reflective of the actual stroke population. And we found the same thing. These are all MET positive patients on the left in A, and again we found that it's 70%. And on the right, for the MET negative patients, again we found that their recovery was negatively related to the extent of stroke lesion damage to those descending corticospinal tract pathways measured with imaging. So it confirmed our previous findings and a larger, more heterogeneous sample. So here are the numbers for you again. This was done slightly earlier. This was at 12 weeks, so it's a little bit under 0.7. We would expect that if we measured them again at 6 months, they would have drifted up towards 0.7. But again, you can see therapy dose doesn't matter, hand dominance doesn't matter, et cetera, et cetera. And for the negative patients, the ones without responses to TMS, it's lesion load on imaging that matters. This is just a really complicated looking graph on the left. These symbols all mean these are people with ischemic or hemorrhagic stroke or previous stroke, and the relationship still holds. This is a subset of the original 207. And again on the right, therapy dose doesn't seem to interact with recovery from impairment in these patients. Okay, so what can we sort of conclude at this point? Well, proportional recovery from upper limb motor impairment is only observed in patients with a functional corticospinal tract. It results in patients regaining around 70% of what they've lost by 3 to 6 months post-stroke. It's observed in all ages, genders, and a range of rehabilitation settings. So other studies have been conducted in the UK, Europe, and US. It's the same answer. Right, so it's not dependent on your health delivery service or the type or amount of rehabilitation that you're delivering. It's observed in patients with either ischemic or hemorrhagic stroke and patients with previous stroke. Right, that's important. So it's kind of, it doesn't care about the pathophysiological mechanism of the stroke. And it is unaffected by current therapy practice. Brian?
For the people who had a previous stroke, is the baseline for what they had lost where they got to in the recovery from the previous stroke, or is it still based on the 66?
It's all calculated the same way. Yeah.
And there's no account of the region of stroke in any of this?
No, we tried that. Actually, we did. I'm sorry that that hasn't been included, but yeah, we considered whether it was a pure subcortical stroke or whether it was a combined cortical and subcortical stroke. Purely cortical strokes are actually very rare, and I don't think we had any in that set. I've only seen 2 in 10 years. So we did consider that. It didn't matter. Yeah. So it really is about that pathway. That just seems to be the key. Yeah. Any other burning questions? You've got a hand hovering. Yeah.
I can sort of wonder, do you think that most strokes could be prevented if people had regular blood tests and did diet and exercise to keep things right?
Yeah, there's quite a conversation to be had actually about stroke prevention, and if it's all right with you, I'm going to park that because I think we're going to come back to it at the end, because I think part of the public service part of the talk is let's think about risk and reducing it. But we'll just keep going with the flow of the story if that's all right. Yeah.
So I wasn't realising it went.
No, we're not quite there. Okay, so this is what we think we can conclude for now about the upper limb. So, what about the lower limb? I know some of you people are pretty interested in legs. So what do we know about that? Well, this is a study published just a couple of months ago by our PhD student, Marie-Claire Smith, as part of her doctorate. And she basically looked at the lower limb using the lower limb Fugl-Meyer score. It's all the same principles, it's just scored out of 34 instead of 66. And she found that again, the proportional recovery rule held. It was still around 70% of the available improvement for all patients, but this time it was regardless of their MEP status. So I'm going to fail to faithfully tell you what all these symbols mean. I'm sorry about that. Trust me, some of them are MEP positive, some of them are MEP negative. But the point is that MEP stat, there is no group of non-fitters, right? There's nobody down here in the bottom right-hand corner who was severely impaired who failed to display proportional recovery. We thought that might be due to sample size, but based on the proportion of patients who do not show proportional recovery in the upper limb, we should have had at least 7, possibly as many as 10 people in this group who did not float up and follow that 70% rule. So this is the first and the only published study of proportional recovery from lower limb impairment. So it needs to be confirmed in a much, much larger sample. But we're getting a hint that maybe MEP status for the lower limb is a lot less important. And I'm sure you can think of some good neuroanatomical reasons for that. And again, she found that recovery from lower limb impairment was not related to therapy dose for the lower limb. So a very similar overall picture to the upper limb. What about other domains? We haven't done this work, but others have. So aphasia, so disturbed communication after stroke. Impairment still recovers by around 70% within 3 months. So the first study showed this back in 2010, that's Ron Lazar. These are small studies, so it's just a hint. But the beta values they found are very close to 0.7, as you can see. So we're getting some hints that other functions or impairments might also recover by around the 70% mark. And just recently as well, Marchi and colleagues looked at recovery from visuospatial neglect, which is where people no longer attend to one side of space, and how that impairment can recover over time. And they also found that it recovers by around 70% within 3 months, again with a beta of 0.71. It starts to get a bit spooky, don't you think? That this number just keeps turning up. And it's across different functional domains, and it's with different measures. Right? There's no Fugel-Meyer scale score for visuospatial neglect or aphasia. These are completely different clinical assessment tools. But we keep landing around 0.7. All right. However, what these two studies also showed was that there is a small subset of patients who do not recover proportionally in either domain. Right? So they're the ones who, like in the upper limb, just were more severely impaired and just failed to follow the 70% rule. But unlike for the upper limb, where we have some idea about that, we think those are the negative ones, those are the ones whose tract no longer works. We don't yet know what it is that distinguishes these patients, other than they have had a more severe stroke. But is there a specific pathway or connection in the brain that has been damaged past the point of no return, which means that they cannot recover proportionally? We don't know. It's far too early. So recovery from impairment, the current thinking is that it actually reflects a spontaneous neurobiological process with which current therapy practices do not seem to interact. Right? So this is just sort of happening, and it's happening across domains, regardless of your age, your gender, how much therapy you get, whether you've had a previous stroke, arms, legs, talking, seeing. This is just a thing that happens in the brain. It seems to be proportional at around 70% for most patients and across functional domains, as I said. And proportional recovery from upper limb but not lower limb motor impairment depends on a functional corticospinal tract. And that might reflect the greater redundancy in neural control of the lower limbs. Right? We have more bilateral and uncrossed pathways. We have plenty of pathways other than the corticospinal tract that contribute to lower limb control. So it could be that we just have more options for the lower limb. And as I said, there is a subset of patients who do not recover proportionally from aphasia and visuospatial neglect, but we don't know if there's a key pathway or connection in their brains which has been damaged, as for the upper limb with the CST, which prevents them from doing so. So what does it all mean? What does it mean for clinical practice? That's the first question. Well, I think what it tells us is that if most people get to around 70%, it's not 100%. So that means that most people are left living with some residual impairment after their stroke. And perhaps the current role of therapy is to help them to learn to function as well as they possibly can by adapting to and compensating for that residual impairment. There is a huge amount of work to do with these patients. As I said, you could have 2 patients with the same level of impairment, and one is actually highly functional and therefore not badly disabled. Right? They're still able to do most of the stuff that they need to do to live, hopefully mostly independently, participate in life roles such as work and parenting. Another person with the same level of impairment has very poor function and is actually quite disabled and not able to participate in their life roles. Right? And the thing is that people can learn to work with their residual impairments and learn to function as well as they possibly can at any point in time after their stroke. Therapy is of value at all points in time after stroke. And so maybe what's really happening here is that the impairment is spontaneously recovering, and therapy is in over the top of that, helping the person to function as well as they can with a huge amount of practice and learning. I'd be interested in your point of view on that when you've had a chance to
I was just thinking as well about what these kind of results do mean for those people that sit, with the upper limb graph that you had, so the non-responders, if you like, to the negative MEPs in the far right-hand corner.
Yep.
So I guess I think about the types of patients that I've treated over the years that would sit down there and, it's a constant battle with yourself because you're always asking yourself, am I doing enough for this patient? Do I need to push them a little bit more? Yep. How long do I go with this? Etc., etc. And I wonder how these kind of results would end up influencing funding and what patients actually receive. Because you could categorise.
I have a whole other talk on that, and we can talk about it over intervals. Cool. Because in fact, what we have done, just to tease you a little bit, what we have done is complete a big study at Auckland City Hospital using an algorithm we have for predicting functional outcome that is not the same as predicting proportional or otherwise recovery from impairment. You see why I had to get the terms straight? So, predicting upper limb functional outcome into 4 distinct functional categories. Yeah. We found that if we share that information, and yes, we do need TMS for that, because you're right, you can have 2 patients who are severely impaired initially. One has got tons of potential, you need to go for it with that person, and the other one is never going to recover good function. They're going to remain very impaired. You as a therapist really could use knowing the difference, right? So that you can adjust your therapy, set realistic goals, and know when this person isn't getting better, it's not your fault. Their brain is really broken, right? Whereas this other person, you do have to push them, back yourself to push them really hard because they've got really good potential. When we implemented this, and it's implemented now at Auckland City Hospital, we found that patients got better faster. We reduced length of stay on average by 6 days, which is huge, with no detrimental effects on patient outcomes or satisfaction. And the therapists were happier. They were more confident that they knew what to do and what to expect for those patients. So it didn't change the outcomes, but it just made for a more efficient, knowledgeable process around rehabilitation for the upper limb. So we're pretty happy with that. Yeah, but that's a whole nother thing. Okay, what does it all mean for clinical research? Well, wouldn't it be awesome if we could increase the proportion above 70%? That would be absolutely tremendous. If patients had less residual impairment, if we could get them to 85%, 90%, then they will have greater function, independence, and quality of life. That would be tremendous. But for those types of studies, I think we're going to have to do 2 things. I don't think there's any point in just giving them lots more of current therapy, because I hope I've shown you that current therapy probably isn't a strong enough signal to the brain to help it resolve impairment by more than 70%. It's going to have to be something different. It's going to have to be a neurobiological agent that speaks directly to the biological processes that are driving recovery from impairment. It's just not going to look like current therapy. It's going to be something completely different. And when we test those treatments, we're going to have to use TMS to know whether this person has the potential to recover proportionally in the first place, right? So if you've got something that you think should take people from 70 to 85%, pick all the MET positive patients. If you think you've got something that can take somebody from not being a proportional recoverer to being a proportional recoverer, pick all the MET negative patients, right? So this TMS becomes a really important patient selection tool depending on what your novel intervention is going to be and how you think it might interact with the underlying mechanisms of proportional recovery. But the great big question still, which I can't answer and nobody can answer, is why on earth is it 70% and not some other number? Why is it 70? Not 53, it's not 87, it's 70. Does it reflect the recovery of neurotransmission and white matter traits? We've got a hint of that from the one study we did showing that actually excitability in the stroke-affected side of the brain also recovers proportionally by about 70%. So it's got something to do with neural excitability, neurotransmission, maybe. we're thinking maybe it's got something to do with remyelination of surviving axons, because we know that surviving axons do remyelinate, but they do so with myelin that is thin and gappy. It's kind of scrappy, and so you lose a lot of the speed of the transmission and also the coherence. Right? Normally your axons, these big myelinated corticospinal tract axons have a really high fidelity signal. We're all transmitting at the same speed, and so you've got this really reliable system for coordinating movement out here. But remyelinated axons create chronodispersion in the descending bullies, right? So you wind up with the signals arriving at the spinal cord at a scattering of times instead of all at the time that you intended up here, right? So that could be part of why you don't make this full recovery from impairment, that the surviving tracts have this quite scrappy remyelination, and that holds back neurotransmission and fidelity of the signal. But we don't know. We have absolutely no idea, really. Nobody does.
There are a lot of animal models of stroke.
Yes, there are.
That would be excellent.
And we're working with
that.
Justin Bean on an endothelin 1 subcortical white matter stroke model, because we think that that's a sensible starting point, as opposed to cortical photothrombotic sorts of stroke models, which actually there's a very poor match between animal models of stroke and stroke in humans in terms of where the stroke is and the tissues damaged. So the subcortical white matter stroke model is very difficult to do, but we're optimistic that it might give us some insights into these possible mechanisms of recovery. Peter?
So you've said what doesn't happen in terms of decent remyelination, but what do we know about what does happen in the recovery process?
What does happen is the neurons themselves recover their function. They re-establish their resting membrane potentials. Their pumps start working and coming online again. So that drives a lot of the initial recovery, just as the tissue itself sort of sorts itself out. Gets some decent food and oxygen in play, gets rid of some of the metabolites, because there's a lot of gunk and inflammation that goes on in there in the first few days. So there's a big resorting that allows those neurons to start firing again. They're alive, but they're just not functional.
Can you measure the revascularization of the stroke region?
Not easily would be my answer to that. Not easily, but I'm sure it's got a really important role to play. And so when we think about, what types of neurobiological interventions we want to try alongside while people are getting their therapy, they are going to be things that improve blood supply, that improve energy supply, that improve just basic metabolic support for these tissues, because they've got a lot of work to do, basically. They've got to, like I say, reset all these neuronal membranes and start remyelinating. All of those oligodendrocytes have to get going, and they take about 12 weeks, which coincidentally is the timeline for the most of the recovery that we see. So we think it's got something to do with it, and if we could find ways to promote it, maybe we could push them past 70%. Yeah. No.
Again, this is just pure speculation.
Go on. I'm here for your speculation.
Again, my knowledge of this myself is very sketchy, just from what I've learned on computer science, mathematics, etc. Might the number of nodes of RANVA actually increase during the recovery, so you get shorter, larger number of shorter segments?
Yeah, so you get paranodal changes, so all of the receptor and membrane transporter expression changes around the nodes after stroke, so these opsons that survive.
If it's a long track with only one synapse in it,
yep.
Might the node, from what I understand, the nodes of RANVA amplify the signal between the different monads?
They assist rapid conduction. Yeah, and so what happens is the nodes widen, and so that does actually slow things down.
Oh, so it's known that the nodes of RANVA won't. What I was thinking is, might the number actually increase after?
I don't know if we know the answer to that, but I think we do know that that's what I mean by gappy myelin, right? So the myelin you normally have quite small gaps where the nodes of RANVA are, but they stretch out, and you get all of these membrane changes over the denuded axon membranes, which would normally be covered with myelin.
Possibly increasing the overall propagation delay.
Yeah, exactly. So it slows everything down. And on top of that, each axon's going to do that in a slightly inconsistent way, and so you get spread of this. You get a greater range of conduction speeds, right? So that disturbs the fidelity of the temporal fidelity
between different fibres.
Yeah.
From what I understand, you get that in buses and computers, and it's called SCID.
Okay.
I'm not an engineer.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Like SCSI, for example, I think suffered from that from the 90s.
From the 90s, I do remember that.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, has there been any studies that have followed patients for a longer term, so 5, 10 years? Do you see any improvement if you were to do, for example, those tests again?
Yeah. So we're doing 2-year follow-ups on these patients now, and most people stay pretty much where we leave them at the 3 to 6 month mark. Very few improve in terms of impairment. Some, about 10 to 15%, improve their function, and that's because they've got the same level of impairment, but they've improved the way they've adapted, they've figured out, they've learned how to work around their impairment to regain more function. But I think the more alarming thing, actually, when you get right out to that 5 or 10 year mark, as you mentioned, is that the people who have survived to those time points often have deteriorated. And there was a large study with hundreds of patients done overseas, not here, that showed that, in fact, people deteriorate almost back to their immediately post-stroke baseline in terms of their functional abilities. So stroke can also be thought of as a neurodegenerative disease. So people deteriorate after stroke at a faster rate than can be explained by their ageing. Yeah. So the longer term, people have to be very good and work quite hard to stay there to prevent a further decline in function and growing impairment.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what they were doing if they had kept up with their therapy throughout that time, because if they had,
would they stay good?
Would they stay good,
yeah,
or would they improve?
I think there's an element of self-fulfilling, I was going to say self-fulfilling prophecy, that's not exactly the word that I want. People who, there's a bit of a threshold, so that Fugl-Meyer score that I talked about out of 66, there's been some good work done showing that you need to, at the end of your rehab, if you're not hitting somewhere in the mid-50s, then you won't be using your hand and arm even half as much as you were before the stroke. And people get into a pattern of what's called disuse. So because their hand and arm are quite impaired and it doesn't function very well, it's your natural tendency is going to be to use your other hand because it's quicker and more efficient and more secure, right? You can just trust that hand to get on with it. And making the mental effort to use this hand, even though it's really slow and clumsy and weak, that actually takes quite a lot of effort and motivation. And so what tends to happen is people, only the least impaired patients will continue to spontaneously use their affected hand and arm. And those seem to be the ones that stay pretty good because they are actually using it and engaging it in their everyday living. Whereas people who don't achieve, what is actually quite a high score, 55-ish out of 66, they're disincentivised to use their hand and arm, and so they tend to get into a pattern, not always, but they can get into a pattern of disuse, and that creates a bit of a downward spiral. Yeah, so it is the challenge. How do we get people to keep going? Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. I have a question. I think the 70 rule do not really exactly apply if your score is very, very close to 66, say 65.
Yeah.
So maybe
no, you're right, it can't. Mathematically that doesn't work, but yes, go on.
So do explore another range where you can have 100%.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the other threshold go? Where?
So I think what you're asking is if we used a different scale that was perhaps more sensitive and had no ceiling effects, would we also see where would people land? Where would those top people land? Is that sort of what you're asking?
That's
or
not exactly.
Not exactly. Go.
But I'm going to stick
go.
to the same method of score that you have.
Yep.
I would say that if you have a very, very close score to the maximum, you can get possibly 100%
Oh yes.
recovery.
Oh yes.
So
people start at 65 and land on 66. Sure, because you can't score 0.7 of a point.
Oh, okay.
Right? Yep. So we do have people who finish with the maximum score.
And they'll probably be the people that fully recover and walk out the door and look pretty good.
They're the ones who are really good.
Yeah.
And they are a very small subset, but those people do exist. Yeah.
They were on your plots before.
Yeah, you can see them down in the bottom left-hand corner.
Yeah.
Those ones. Yeah.
Oh, I thought there was a. If you go back to any one of your graphs, there's a rigid line that you can see. Those are the people that get back to
Oh,
full recovery.
no, the ones on the line are at 0.7.
The ones on the plotted line, but there's ones that sit above the line, for example.
Let's find a good upper limb one.
Here we go. This one. Stop
Yeah.
here.
Oh yeah, so these
look
guys
at
are
that, they're
sitting.
all the way there.
Yeah.
They're the ones that all get
You can pick them out.
fully recovered
Yeah.
on that straight line, right?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So it is possible to make full recovery. So, you know, these have confidence intervals around them, these betas, right? So we can't say every single person is going to make exactly 70% recovery. That's never going to work in the real world. But it's striking that it keeps landing right on or around 0.7. And the more data we accumulate, the smaller those confidence intervals get. It's a really strong relationship. And even when you give it lots of other predictors to choose from, it comes back to your available improvement. That's the main predictor for how much you will recover by. Cool.
So I'm going to have to jump to the lower limb.
Go on, I was hoping you would.
So you know, trying to wrap your head around Marie Claire's new results.
Yeah.
You know, how important is the role of lower level control, spinal cord control, then in terms of these results?
Yeah. There's no walking in the Fugl-Meyer, right? So the Fugl-Meyer for both the upper and lower limb just tests basic movements like strength and range of single joint movement, as well as some synergistic, or more importantly, out of synergy movements. So can you perform out of synergy? Reflexes. The Fugl-Meyer has sensory subscales, but these aren't included here because sensation is a whole other domain that needs investigating. So in terms of the potential role of things like CPGs responsible for helping to control walking, I don't think they would play a role in the lower limb Fugl-Meyer scores. Yeah.
Because I'm wondering if, in terms of the afferent feedback too, you know,
Yep.
how important that then plays a role in that, in the reafference of movement tasks.
Yep.
And, you know, if you don't have the need necessarily for that in the lower limb, whether or not, if it's just more kind of reflex control anyway,
Yeah.
whether or not you have then the motor evoked potential intact doesn't matter so much because it's at a different level.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a different thing. So the MEPs that she recorded were of tibialis anterior and vastus lateralis, just to try and get something a bit more proximal, something a bit more distal. We know that tibialis anterior has quite a large cortical representation. So, like all good people who just finished her PhD, like literally handed in on Friday, she's all excited about doing this again. Unbelievable. I know. What's wrong with you? Don't watch anything. So she's all excited about doing this again because this is still a relatively small sample, you know, and we just, TMS for the lower limb is hard because of where the lower limb motor cortex representations are. They're tucked down in the central or longitudinal fissure. So we've got a much higher risk of false negatives. That's what it comes down to. But the fact remains that she still didn't find anyone who didn't follow the 70% proportional recovery rule. There's still one group of patients here. So MEP status is useful in the upper limb for identifying who won't follow the rule. But given that everybody is following the rule, maybe it's not surprising that MEP status is just sort of not that important. So she had some ideas about possible contributions from other descending pathways that might matter, that we can't actually access with TMS. Yeah, so that might not be the answer. So we're thinking about MRI, seeing if we can work it out, find a measure that
Functional
way.
MRI?
No, just structural.
Okay.
Yeah, just structural MRI. Yep.
Have you evaluated facial weakness or speech recovery?
Facial weakness and speech recovery, no, we haven't looked at that, nor has anybody else. And that's primarily because we don't have any good clinical measures of impairment in those things. So where we do have good clinical scales for aphasia, which is communication and neglect and vision, reasonable clinical measures for somatosensory function and certainly motor impairment, we don't have any good scales for grading recovery from facial weakness or dysarthria. Yeah, so it's a bit of bit of an area that is going to be a bit more challenging, I think, to see whether or not these rules still hold. Yeah. Bruce?
Cathy, the original paper you spoke about, the one that led to the Diffusion test,
Yeah.
that's purely empirical analysis, is it? That's based on data, or does it include just that?
Yeah.
It doesn't include any kind of neural theory basic component?
No, I mean they did that. The very original study by Prabhakaran used the Fugel-Meyer scale because it's been around since the 70s and it's probably the most widely used and validated evaluation of motor impairment. But they did just use those data, and they did look for other predictors. They did put in things like age or gender, but none of that came up, and that's since been shown time and again by all the subsequent studies that those factors just don't seem to matter. And they speculated in that paper that maybe the people who were not following the 70% sort of rule, as they called it at the time, were the ones who didn't have a functional corticospinal tract, but they didn't have the means to test it. And so several studies were published in the interim, still without using TMS, and so we just thought, well, we've got the tools, so let's actually find out. And yeah, we're pretty happy to find in 2 subsequent studies that, MEP status really matters for whether or not you follow the rule. At least for the upper limb, like I say, might not be the case for the lower limb, but I think we need to do that again with a much larger group of patients.
And that test is just purely a test which focuses on the function that was lost, or is it a broader, I mean, you're losing some mass, and that's recruiting other neurons to cover for that, but does that test purely test the performance in the area of motor performance, or is it broader than that?
Do you mean the TMS or the Fugel-Meyer?
It's Fugel-Meyer.
The Fugel-Meyer. The Fugel-Meyer isn't specific to stroke. It can be used in a range of clinical settings. So it measures things like your ability to, extend your wrist against gravity in 2 different postures, one in and out of synergy, rhythmic coordinated movements, picking things up, pinch grip, hand grip, reflexes.
But still upper limb function.
It's all upper limb impairment, yeah. Yeah, so it's quite specific to the upper limb, and then the Fugel-Meyer lower limb scale is specific to the lower limb. They both have sensory components. Fugel-Meyer was a Swede who just did a huge amount of work on this in the 70s, and it stood the test of time. Yeah.
Maybe a general comment, because it's good that we've never let you finish your seminar with a number of questions. But on one hand, I really enjoyed it. I thought it's also kind of depressing that you can get the 70% on one side, and on the other side, it seems that because it's so fixated on 70%, any improvement or any potential drug therapy or other device therapy, you have a means to test against.
Yes.
But on one side, it's kind of depressing.
It's a bit of good news, bad news. I think it is important to remember that some people do, in fact, make a full recovery from impairment. The more mild ones, obviously. 70%. I think we take it more as a challenge and find it very motivating rather than demotivating. And you're right. We do have now a really different way of looking at the effects of our interventions. So traditionally, we might have intervention and just randomly allocate 2 groups of people and just look for outcome, right? So that's the classic. We're going to measure them in 3 months' time, compare their scores on Fugel-Meyer, and see if one group, the treated group, has higher, their average Fugel-Meyer score is higher than the other group. And I hope what I've convinced you of today is that that's actually not going to be a sensible approach, because they're all going to start in different places, they're all going to finish in different places, it's going to be incredibly noisy. The more sensitive measure for whether or not your treatment has interacted with the neurobiology of recovery is what is the proportional recovery from impairment. And is the proportion different in those 2 different treatment and control groups? So I think from a clinical trials perspective, I think this information is incredibly powerful. I think it will change the way that trials are designed and improve their sensitivity hugely, which is exactly what stroke rehabilitation needs. In the last 6 years, we've had 8 major multi-centre rehab trials, all of which are neutral, right? And it represents the investment of just thousands of people's time, the patients themselves, millions and millions of dollars. And so it's hard to stay excited about trying to make a difference. And one of the biggest problems we have is trial sensitivity. The treatment and control arms are usually low contrast, they're too similar. And we don't have good ways to select and stratify our patients in these trials, although I think this is going to be a really helpful way. I think MET status is really important for the upper limb. And we're probably not measuring recovery in a way that is really sensitive to whether or not the intervention is interacting with the recovery process. If you just measure outcome on average for the group at 3 or 6 months, I think you're going to miss a lot of what's happening underneath. So I hear what you're saying, and I tend to stay positive about it. Yeah.
I think it's actually really depressing in some senses, in the sense of when you talk about therapy dose, unfortunately there's numerous amounts of studies that support that therapy doesn't meet the needs of what we've seen in kind of animal models.
Yep.
So we're in a situation as therapists that we can't provide the dose that we know that we need to drive those neural changes.
Yep.
So I feel like, as well as all of this stuff that's really exciting and really interesting in terms of measurement, I feel like therapy itself needs to turn around on its head and actually do something different to try and meet the needs of the patients with the doses that we know that we should be reaching.
Yep.
And it would be really interesting to see what would happen if we did actually meet those dosages and how we would predict recovery and things like that as well.
Yep, I completely agree. And so I think there's a huge amount of work to do just to see what are we currently doing, and if we bring it to a dose that we know can change the brain in an animal model, will it actually produce a meaningful change in recovery in humans? We actually don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
So we need to be quite ambitious in the way that we design these trials. And that's what I tell my clinical colleagues. We need to be really ambitious with therapy and in trial design. And we need to stop testing rehab as though it's a drug, right? Drug trial designs are just not appropriate for rehabilitation after an injury like stroke. They're never going to tell us what's actually effective. So, the whole discipline needs a bit of a shake, in my view. Yeah. Angus?
Yeah, thanks. So if you just did the upper limb study on its own, you might conclude that the corticospinal tracts, or proportional recovery of the property of the corticospinal tract.
Seems to need it, but beyond that...
So, and then there's the special group of MEP non-responders who don't match it. But obviously, if you're aphasic, you're not using the corticospinal tract.
It might not be in trouble.
Right, and the hemispatial neglect. Again.
Could be perfectly fine from a motor perspective.
Yeah, so could we come up with a sort of a general rule for who's not going to recover to 70%, like those MEP negative people? What's the special category there?
I think it's going to depend on the residual capacity of the network responsible for the function. So when you're looking at things like communication and visuospatial neglect, they're far more networked function. And I just think it's going to depend, at least in part, on what's the residual anatomical capacity of that network. And once, I think there is something like a point of no return. The corticospinal tract is the simplest network. It's just 2 nodes and one connection. It's pretty basic. Does it qualify as a network? I don't know. But once it's damaged past that point of no return, it cannot exhibit proportional recovery. That's not to say that there's no recovery mechanisms in play. Of course the brain, on a biological level, is busy trying to repair damage and do its best, but it's not going to be able to follow that proportional recovery rule because the substrate is absent. And I just suspect that in other domains, such as communication and attention, that we'll see something similar, but what we can't do is just put our fingers on one single simple tract and say that's the one. If that goes past a certain point, you're not going to do the 70% thing, right? But that's an open question. At the moment, we only have maybe 50 patients that tell us that it's 70% in those other domains, and I think there's a lot of work to do to replicate that. We're up over 500, approaching 600 for the upper limb, and it's once we get to those sorts of numbers, we can be more confident that it's a real thing. Yeah. Final question?
Yeah. Sorry to ask you, but this was something that just came up in a casual conversation with somebody I know who went to medical school, but has not worked in the medical field. I've actually studied second-year psychology back in college, so I learned a bit about neuroscience from that. But Am I right in thinking, in terms of neuroscience, we still don't even understand the exact format of the signal going down the optic nerve?
I will leave the optic nerve people to answer that. It's a very specific question.
Okay.
Yep.
Or,
Well, we know that nerves transmit with action potentials along
yeah, but do we
axons.
know
So
exactly what each fibre of it
each
carries?
axon is doing,
Exactly what each axon is doing.
carrying an action potential.
Corresponding to what feature of the image can has an understood that.
Depends on what the
Or
sense-
the simple question, do we have any way of
Please
cutting it
answer
in half
me.
and-
Simple question.
of cutting it in half and tapping the signal going through it?
I'm not sure. That's my answer.
Okay.
That seems like a good place to stop before you guys ask me anything harder. Thank you.
Fantastic.